They say our street is the kind of place where dreams grow faster than the grass. What they don't say is how many secrets get buried in that same soil. Every house here has its own version of perfection. Painted shutters, trimmed hedges, and smiles practiced enough to pass for sincerity. I used to fit right in. I baked lemon bars for the HOA, waved to Mrs. Jensen when she peeked from behind her curtains, and kept my husband's shirts pressed so well they could have applied for citizenship in Pleasantville. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. Daniel used to love that about me, or at least he said he did, back when I was juggling 3 jobs and living mostly on caffeine and a stubborn sense of loyalty. He'd say, "Em, you're the most supportive person I know." And I'd smile, not realizing that supportive was just another word for useful. Now, when I look back, I can practically hear the sarcasm dripping from the universe. Our house sits near the end of Willow Creek Drive, a cul-de-sac where everyone waves just a little too long. I still wave, out of habit, but my mind's usually somewhere else, like trying to figure out when my husband turned into a stranger who wears tailored suits and a smirk sharp enough to slice through dinner conversation. I met Daniel when I was 24, fresh out of grad school with a stack of student loans and an optimism problem. He had a half-baked tech idea and a grin that could have sold bottled water to fish. I believed in him, maybe too much. For 7 years, I worked late nights, tutoring high school kids, editing copy for ad agencies, teaching part-time, while he built the dream. The dream, as it turned out, was his. Now he runs a company I technically co-funded, though he prefers to introduce me as a great supporter of the early phase. Translation: unpaid labor with a side of emotional exhaustion. I started noticing the shift about a year ago. He stopped telling me about product launches and started spending more time on business trips. His phone lived face down. His tone sharpened when I asked simple questions. At first, I told myself it was stress. Every startup founder hits a rough patch, right? But then came Monica, his mother. If Daniel is a storm, Monica is the climate. Cold, unyielding, and always there. She never liked me. She'd drop little comments like, "Emily dear, not everyone's cut out for this lifestyle." Or, "It's nice you still work. It must keep you grounded." Translation: I'll never think you're good enough for my son. Daniel used to defend me. Used to. Now he mostly defends her. I was sitting at our kitchen island one evening, laptop open, a mug of lukewarm tea by my elbow, when I noticed his smartwatch buzzing on the counter. He was upstairs on a call, pacing, voice low and urgent. I tried not to look. I really did. But the screen lit up again, and curiosity isn't a sin, it's survival. The message read, "See you at the lake house. S." I blinked. The lake house? We didn't have a lake house. I scrolled through my mind like a Rolodex of past conversations. No mention of property, no casual, "Oh, by the way, I bought a house by the lake." I thought maybe it was a rental, maybe something business-related. But then I saw the heart emoji, bold and taunting, sitting there like a smirk in text form. He came downstairs, still on the phone. "Yeah, Sophie, I'll be there around 7. Just make sure." He froze when he saw me, then smiled the way someone does when they have been caught but think they can still talk their way out of it. "Hey, Em, I'll be late tonight. Investor dinner." "Investor dinner?" "Sure," I smiled back, because sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon. "Of course," I said. "Try not to overspend." He laughed, grabbed his keys, and left. The door clicked shut, and I sat there, the message still glowing in my head. Sophie, so that was S. I'd met her once, briefly. She was introduced as Daniel's operations consultant, which I'm fairly sure was corporate language for inappropriate. She was the kind of woman who said things like, "I'm not into drama," right before creating some. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but then again, the last time I ignored my instincts, Daniel convinced me to invest my savings into his startup instead of a retirement plan. My instincts deserved another shot. The next morning, he left for a quick trip upstate. I waited an hour, then borrowed his old sedan, the one with the temperamental AC and glove compartment full of expired mints, and followed the address I found in his calendar app. He never did learn how to password protect things properly. The lake was about an hour and a half away, tucked behind pine trees and smugly expensive cabins. The kind of place where people go to escape the messes they make elsewhere. The house wasn't huge, but it was polished. Modern glass panels, sleek balcony, and 2 cars parked out front. Daniel's new one and a red convertible that practically screamed Sophie. I parked a little up the road, heart pounding more from anger than nerves. The air smelled of rain and pine needles, and I could hear faint laughter from inside the house. Through the window, I saw them. Daniel, casual and laughing, pouring wine. Sophie leaning against the counter, her hand on his wrist. It wasn't cinematic or glamorous. It was infuriatingly ordinary. That's what hurt most, the ease of it. I didn't storm in. I'm not the storming in type. Instead, I took pictures. I'm thorough like that. The reflection of their glasses clinking in the window pane. The way her arm brushed his shoulder. Evidence, not melodrama. When I turned to leave, a motion light flicked on near the garage, startling me. I ducked behind a row of trash bins, silently cursing my decision to wear heels. My hand brushed something, a folder sitting on top of one bin, half soaked from drizzle. The label, handwritten, said, Prenup, Paris copy. Paris. That's where we'd signed it, back when Daniel proposed under some fairy-lit terrace, promising forever and balance and mutual respect. I remembered the way he'd looked at me then, earnest and ambitious. I wondered if he'd already been thinking about ownership percentages even then. I took the folder. Call it poetic justice or strategic timing, they never saw me. Sophie did glance toward the window once, squinting, but then laughed and turned away. Probably thought it was wildlife. I drove home in silence, the road curving through woods that looked too peaceful for what my mind was doing. I wasn't crying. Crying was for people who still hoped. I was strategizing. By the time I reached Willow Creek Drive, my calm had returned. The street looked the same, perfect lawns, perfect facades. Greg Yates was outside adjusting his sprinkler system like it was a NASA project. He waved. Morning, Emily. Daniel out of town again? I smiled. Business trip. He nodded knowingly. Those tech guys never rest, huh? Apparently not, I said, and walked inside. The house smelled like nothing. No warmth, no comfort. Just emptiness masked by lemon-scented cleaner. I poured myself a drink and sat on the couch, the folder open beside me. The prenup was exactly as I remembered. Meticulous, notarized, signed in Paris. Except this copy had Daniel's signature duplicated in another clause. A clause about intellectual property and marital contribution, something his lawyer probably hoped I'd forgotten. I hadn't. The rain started outside, soft but steady, like the world was giving me background music for a realization. I'd spent years keeping Daniel's dream afloat, patching holes he didn't even know existed. And now, while he played successful visionary with someone half my age, I was sitting on legal proof that his empire wasn't entirely his. There's a strange calm that comes with clarity. It's not joy, not relief, more like the exact moment you decide to stop being reasonable. When Daniel came home 2 days later, he looked tired and self-satisfied. Long trip, he said, dropping his keys on the counter. Investors went great. Oh? I asked, pretending to scroll through my phone. Did Sophie help? His eyes flicked up, sharp. What? I smiled. You mentioned her last week. Just wondering if she joined the investor dinner. He hesitated, then chuckled in that dismissive way people do when they think you're naive. No, she's just a consultant. Don't start overthinking things. I wanted to laugh, really laugh, but I just nodded. Of course not. You know me, Daniel. Always supportive. That night, I lay awake while he snored beside me, the soft rhythm of hypocrisy filling the room. My mind was already drafting steps. A sequence. Not revenge exactly, more like restoration. By morning, I'd called a lawyer. I met her in a cafe downtown, the kind of place that serves pastries so perfect you almost feel guilty eating them. She was brisk, efficient, and exactly the kind of person Daniel would underestimate. I handed her the folder. Prenup? She said. Original copy. He forgot it existed. She flipped through the pages, eyebrows lifting. Mrs. Ross, this changes everything. I smiled. That's the idea. When I drove home, the neighborhood was buzzing. Apparently Monica had hosted a brunch that morning. I knew because half the street had attended, and Greg Yates made sure to tell me about it while trimming his roses. Emily, you missed quite the gathering, he said. Monica was talking about Daniel's company. Said they're going public soon. Big money. I gave a polite nod. Good for them. He leaned closer, lowering his voice like a gossip columnist. She also mentioned you might be stepping back from things? Is that true? I laughed softly. Greg, I wouldn't believe everything Monica says. She's allergic to accuracy. His grin faltered. Right. Of course. Inside, I shut the door and exhaled. So Monica was already trying to rewrite my role. Typical. That evening, I set the dinner table as usual, because pretending still had its uses. Daniel walked in, loosening his tie, humming. Long day, he said, kissing my cheek absently. By the way, my mom wants to do dinner Sunday. She thinks we should talk about finances. Does she? I said, carefully cutting my chicken. He nodded, oblivious. You know how she is. She just wants to make sure you're secure if the company keeps growing. I nearly laughed out loud. Secure. The man was planning his own narrative, and he thought I'd play my part. Sure, I said. Sunday works. He smiled, relieved. You're the best, Em. I watched him across the table, every gesture suddenly transparent. The way he avoided my eyes when his phone buzzed, the little twitch in his jaw when he lied. I realized I wasn't married to a stranger. I was married to a story I'd outgrown. Later that night, when he fell asleep, I went into his office. The computer hummed quietly. I opened a drawer, searching, and there it was, a new contract draft labeled Equity Adjustment Proposal. My name wasn't anywhere in it. I stared at it for a long moment, then closed the drawer. No fury, just focus. Because I'd already decided. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to win. And when I did, I'd make sure he knew exactly who helped him build his empire, and who could take half of it with one signature. The next morning, he kissed my forehead on his way out. Love you, he said, casual, distracted. Love you too, I replied, smiling. But in my head, I was already in the courtroom, folder in hand, waiting for him to walk in and realize that the game was finally fair. He just didn't know it yet. Outside, the sprinklers hummed across the lawns, each droplet catching the sunlight like glass. Perfect lawns, perfect lies. And somewhere between them, I finally felt like myself again. The underdog had woken up. The lake road was narrower than I expected, and each turn felt like it might lead to some revelation that would rewrite my life. The trees leaned in close, tall enough to make me feel like I was driving through a tunnel of secrets. I didn't play music. Silence was more useful. It let me hear my thoughts sorting themselves into categories. Facts, suspicions, and plans. Daniel thought he was clever. Tech genius, investment whisperer, the man who turned coffee and arrogance into a company. But he'd forgotten something crucial. I'd built him from the ground up. I knew how his mind worked, the way he hid guilt behind confidence, the way he left digital fingerprints on every so-called secret. He could build apps, but couldn't hide his passwords. I'd already traced his messages, calendar invites, and that smugly labeled contact. SL, work. The work in question was apparently at a lake house he never mentioned owning. That's where I was headed now, on a Tuesday morning when every other responsible adult was at their desk or folding laundry. I'd told no one where I was going. I didn't want advice, or pity, or anyone telling me to take the high road. The high road was for people who hadn't been lied to. I slowed as the GPS announced, "Arriving at your destination." My destination looked like something from a lifestyle magazine. Gray siding, big windows, deck with white railings, and a view of a lake so still it looked fake. 2 cars sat out front, Daniel's in the same red convertible I'd seen before. Sophie's car looked as smug as she did. I parked a little down the dirt path, hidden behind a cluster of pines. The air smelled like wet leaves and secrets. My palms were clammy, but I wasn't scared. This wasn't about confrontation, it was reconnaissance. I wanted truth, and truth required observation. Through the side windows, I saw movement. Daniel was inside in jeans and a button-down, pouring wine at noon like the rules of real life didn't apply to him. Sophie leaned against the counter, blonde hair tucked perfectly behind one ear, wearing a loose sweater that screamed effortless charm. She laughed at something he said, a light, confident laugh that grated on me more than I'd admit. I inched closer, careful not to crunch gravel underfoot. The porch steps creaked faintly, but the wind covered the sound. I could see their reflections in the glass, her hand brushing his arm, his smile growing a little too proud. It wasn't theatrical, it wasn't cinematic, it was simply ordinary, and somehow that made it worse. They looked like they'd done this before, many times, comfortable in their routine. He even poured her wine into the same kind of glass he used for me. Maybe he'd bought a bulk set, efficiency over intimacy. I took out my phone, pressed record, and zoomed in. It wasn't about proof for court. I already had enough with the prenup. It was about understanding, about seeing with my own eyes what kind of man I'd married. They talked about investors, about a new expansion. Sophie leaned closer and whispered something that made Daniel grin. Then she said, "What about her? She won't find out, right?" "She's not exactly the investigative type," he said. I almost laughed out loud. If irony were a weapon, he'd be in pieces. Sophie continued, "You sure you can handle both? Her and the company? Daniel's voice lowered. I'm handling everything just fine. I pressed my phone tighter, the lens trembling. He wasn't handling anything fine. He was running on borrowed confidence and lies. I thought about how I'd skipped vacations to fund his first prototypes, how I'd written his early investor pitches while he took credit for creative input. I thought about the nights I stayed awake proofreading his contracts while he slept. Sophie moved closer. You deserve more appreciation, she said. Oh, I'll get it, he replied, voice smooth and smug. Once this new deal goes through, I'll be free of all the old obligations. Old obligations? That was me, apparently. 7 years of devotion summed up like a utility bill he couldn't wait to cancel. Something in me shifted. Not rage, not sorrow, just a sharp sort of clarity. If this was the life he'd chosen, I could play by his rules. But unlike him, I understood timing. I backed away quietly, slipping around the side of the house. A faint scratching sound caught my ear. A raccoon, maybe. Or fate getting dramatic. I ignored it and followed a small path that led behind the garage. That's when I saw it. A small metal filing cabinet, half covered by a tarp. Inside were scattered papers, likely from the office. Curiosity guided me more than strategy. I pulled open the top drawer. Receipts, blueprints, tax forms. Then a folder labeled Personal Paris. I knew that word by heart now. I flipped it open, and there it was again. The prenup copy, printed, signed, perfectly preserved. My name, his, and the date that had once meant romance and now tasted like irony. Except there was something new. A note stapled inside, written in his handwriting. Keep this hidden. She doesn't remember the clause details anyway. He'd kept it. He'd known it existed. He'd hidden it intentionally. I slipped the folder into my bag, quiet as a breeze, and turned to leave. From the kitchen window came laughter again, high-pitched, indulgent. Sophie was holding up a piece of paper, probably his new project sketch. I realized then how comfortable she looked, like she thought she belonged. I whispered, "Not for long," and left. Halfway to my car, the motion sensor light blinked on, flooding the yard in bright white. My pulse jumped, but I stayed still. The light clicked off again, and I exhaled slowly. Sophie's voice drifted faintly through the window. Did you hear something? Daniel replied. Probably raccoons again. Of course. Raccoons. That's what wives become when you stop looking closely, background noise with claws. The drive home felt shorter, maybe because my thoughts filled every space where anxiety used to live. I replayed every word they'd said. Old obligations. She won't find out. Every syllable was an investment in my next move. Back on Willow Creek Drive, everything looked as staged as ever. Mrs. Jensen was watering her geraniums. Greg Yates was hovering near his mailbox, pretending to check the mail for the third time that day. He waved as I passed, the same too-friendly wave of someone who'd trade your privacy for a juicy quote. I waved back, parked, and sat in the driveway for a moment. The lake house, the laughter, the note, it all felt strangely unreal. But the folder in my bag grounded me. That document was my leverage, and leverage was power. Inside, I placed the folder on the dining table, right next to Daniel's perfectly folded napkin. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. Quiet, like something waiting. I poured myself a glass of water, sat down, and opened my laptop. My lawyer's email was still open from yesterday. I attached a few photos I'd taken at the lake. Nothing dramatic, just enough to timestamp Daniel's whereabouts. Then I drafted a message. Additional materials for our case. Also found a copy of the prenup Daniel kept. Let's discuss the implications tomorrow. I hit send. Then I stared at the screen, wondering how it was possible to feel so calm. Maybe clarity really was its own kind of armor. When Daniel got home that evening, he looked radiant in that insufferable way of people who think they've gotten away with something. He dropped his briefcase, kissed the air near my cheek, and poured himself whiskey. Long day, he said. Meetings ran late. I nodded, not looking up from my laptop. That explains why you smell like the lake. His hand froze midair. What? I tilted my head. You always come home smelling like that after investor meetings. Must be some aquatic perfume trend. He laughed, but it was forced. You're funny. Am I? I smiled. You used to say that. You stopped somewhere around the time your startup stopped needing my paycheck. He took a long sip, the kind that buys time. We've both changed, Em. True, I said, but only one of us changed the address of their meetings. He frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, I said lightly. Just thinking out loud. For the rest of dinner, he talked about potential investors and new product lines. I nodded, playing the attentive wife role I'd perfected years ago. Inside, I was rewriting the ending. After he went to bed, I scrolled through Sophie's social media. She'd posted a photo earlier that day, a lake view, wine glasses, captioned, "Productive Tuesday with a visionary mind." I almost applauded her creativity. She'd hidden Daniel's reflection in the glass, but forgot the timestamp. Rookie mistake, I saved it. Another puzzle piece. The next morning, my lawyer called. "Emily, that copy you found, are you sure it's original?" "Signed and dated in Paris, with witness initials. It's airtight." She paused. "Then this shifts the entire property valuation. You're not just entitled to support, you own part of his company by clause definition." I smiled into my coffee. "That's what I thought. Do you want to proceed with a formal filing?" "Not yet," I said. "I want him to walk himself into the hole first." When I hung up, I felt lighter. Not happier. Happiness was a luxury for honest people, but purposeful. Over the next few days, I went through the motions. I met with clients, joined a neighborhood brunch, smiled at Monica when she mentioned how hard Daniel's been working. She said it like she was reciting a prayer. "That's true," I said. "He's been working overtime, at the lake." Her eyes narrowed. "What lake?" I shrugged. "Oh, didn't he tell you?" Then I changed the subject to scones. Let her wonder. That night, I sat outside on the porch, wine glass in hand, watching the lights flicker across the neighborhood. Greg strolled by with his dog, pretending not to stare at my house. He loved a story, and I was about to give him one. The next day, I stopped by Sophie's social feed again. She'd posted another picture, this time a champagne glass on Daniel's kitchen counter, my kitchen counter. The marble pattern was unmistakable. That was the moment something inside me steadied into resolve. No fury, no heartbreak, just certainty. I didn't need confrontation. I didn't need apologies. I needed results. So I waited, played patient, gathered proof like puzzle pieces. When Daniel mentioned a strategy dinner later that week, I smiled sweetly and asked what he'd like for breakfast tomorrow. He relaxed immediately. Guilt makes people predictable. The next morning, I left before him, claiming I had errands. In reality, I drove back to the lake house, this time with purpose. The same two cars were there. I parked farther away, walked the last quarter mile, and approached from the lakeside path. Through the glass wall, I could see them arguing. Sophie's hands waved wildly. Daniel looked defensive. Even from outside, I could guess the topic. Exposure. Maybe Monica had called him. Maybe the walls were already cracking. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I recorded a short clip of their gestures. Visual chaos, tension, familiarity. Then I turned and left. That night, I uploaded the clip to a private folder and labeled it Insurance. He came home later than usual, hair tousled, shirt untucked. "Traffic," he said. "Of course," I replied, closing my laptop. He smiled faintly, almost relieved that I wasn't accusing him. Poor Daniel. He still thought the silence meant surrender. What it really meant was that the match was already lit. He just hadn't noticed the fuse. Before bed, I stood at the window, watching the sprinklers spin across the lawns again. Every droplet shimmered in the porch lights, neat and rhythmic. Somewhere nearby, someone was laughing too loudly at a neighbor's barbecue. The world looked so normal, it was almost absurd. But under that surface, everything was shifting. Daniel had his secrets. I had mine now, too. And unlike his, mine came with legal weight, documented proof, and the kind of quiet precision that would make his arrogance look like a rookie mistake. I turned off the light and whispered to myself, let him sleep easy tonight. Because soon he wouldn't. The courthouse smelled faintly like floor polish and nerves. I sat on the wooden bench outside the hearing room, staring at the clock as if watching it could slow the inevitable. 10 minutes until Daniel walked in with that same confident swagger that once made me love him. 10 minutes until the version of our life he'd invented collapsed under its own arrogance. I wasn't scared. At least that's what I told myself. What I felt was more like a tight coil of focus, the kind that comes after months of being dismissed, ignored, and underestimated. That morning, I'd stood in front of my mirror and told my reflection, "Today, Emily Ross stops apologizing." My reflection had nodded in quiet agreement. The heavy door creaked open. My lawyer, Rebecca Lang, stepped out. Mid-40s, calm, efficient, eyes sharp behind her glasses. She carried the folder that contained my future. "You ready?" she asked. "As ready as someone who just found out her husband rehearsed betrayal," I said. Her lips twitched. "Good. Stay composed. We have everything we need." When we entered, the room buzzed faintly with that electric hum of whispered gossip. Daniel was already there with his lawyer, a younger man in a too expensive suit, all confidence and charm with nothing substantial behind it. Monica sat behind them, chin high, wearing the expression of someone who still believed she could control the narrative. Daniel turned as I walked in. "Emily," he said, voice silky. "You look formal." "I was going for unrecognizable," I replied, taking my seat. His smile faltered, just slightly. That was my first victory of the day. Judge Halpern entered, a tall man with a no-nonsense presence and the weary patience of someone who's seen every variety of human foolishness. We all stood, then sat as the bailiff announced the case. Daniel's lawyer began smoothly. "Your Honor, my client seeks a fair division of assets following the dissolution of marriage. Mrs. Ross has contributed little to the business in question, and while we respect her efforts, her financial input was minimal." Minimal. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Rebecca rose, composed and steady. "Your Honor, that statement is factually incorrect. We'll be providing documentation showing Mrs. Ross funded 80% of the company's initial investment." Daniel's lawyer blinked. "That's impossible," I finished for him, my voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the room. "You should see the receipts." Rebecca slid the first folder across the table. Inside were bank statements, wire transfers, emails, the kind of detailed paper trail Daniel had thought I'd forgotten. Daniel frowned, leaning toward his lawyer. "We agreed that was personal support, not investment." Rebecca adjusted her glasses. "The prenup disagrees." The judge looked up. "Prenup?" Rebecca smiled faintly. "Yes, Your Honor, signed in Paris. My client has the original copy." The room went still. I could hear Monica's faint intake of breath behind us. Daniel's lawyer recovered quickly. "We were not made aware of any active prenuptial agreement." "Because Mr. Ross chose not to disclose it," Rebecca said, sliding the folder forward. "He not only signed this agreement, but specifically acknowledged that Mrs. Ross's financial contributions granted her silent partnership rights to his patents and intellectual property." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is this accurate, Mr. Ross?" Daniel's face went pale in a way money couldn't hide. I didn't think that clause was valid. It was supposed to exist?" I interrupted, smiling. "It does. And apparently you've been keeping your own copy labeled Paris in your lake house filing cabinet." That got everyone's attention. Monica shifted in her seat. "Emily, there's no need to bring personal matters." "With respect, Mrs. Ross," Judge Halpern said firmly, "you're not a party in this case." She fell silent, her lips pressed tight. Daniel's lawyer fumbled with his papers. "Even so, this doesn't automatically grant Mrs. Ross half the business. We'd need proof of ongoing involvement." Rebecca stood again, sliding another folder forward. "Emails, notes, and meeting logs showing Mrs. Ross's editing of early investor presentations, as well as funding transfers from her personal accounts. Her role was advisory and financial. That satisfies the clause requirements." The judge reviewed the pages slowly, occasionally glancing up at Daniel, who now looked less like a visionary and more like a man watching his empire spring leaks in real time. I stayed quiet, my hands folded neatly on the table. Inside, I could feel the satisfaction building, steady and methodical. Every time he shifted in his chair, I felt years of being sidelined loosen their grip on me. Finally, Judge Halpern looked up. "The evidence supports Mrs. Ross's claim. The prenup stands. Mrs. Ross retains a 50% stake in the business and associated intellectual property." The sound Daniel made was somewhere between disbelief and indignation. "You can't—" The judge raised a hand. "I can, and I have. Perhaps next time you'll read the documents you sign." Rebecca gathered our files, calm as ever. "Thank you, Your Honor." Daniel turned to me, voice low. "Emily, this isn't over." I met his gaze and smiled the way you do when you're done being afraid. "It actually is." Monica stood, her composure cracking for the first time. "Daniel, how could you let this happen? You told me she had nothing." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Mom, not now?" "Oh, I think now is perfect," I said, rising from my seat. "Since we're all being honest, maybe she should know about Sophie, too." Rebecca put a hand on my arm, subtle but firm. "Let's not," she murmured. I nodded, but couldn't resist adding, "You might want to check the lake house before you lecture anyone about responsibility." The color drained from Monica's face. "The what?" "Never mind," I said sweetly, turning toward the door. The hallway outside felt brighter somehow, the kind of brightness that comes when the air finally clears after a long storm. I didn't walk out triumphant. I walked out steady. The world hadn't changed, but I had. Rebecca caught up with me near the elevator. That went exceptionally well, she said. Exceptional isn't the word Daniel would use, I replied. She smiled. You handled it perfectly. Calm, factual, composed, judges like that. I've had practice. Now that the ruling's in your favor, we can start discussing settlement terms, I nodded, though my mind was already elsewhere. Half his company meant freedom, yes, but it also meant responsibility. It meant I'd have to decide what to do with all that power. I didn't want to destroy him completely, not yet. I wanted him to watch as I outgrew the role he'd written for me. When I arrived home, the mailbox was overflowing with flyers and neighborhood newsletters. The latest HOA update had a headline about the upcoming spring gala, a celebration of community. I almost laughed. I carried the mail inside, dropped it on the counter, and poured a glass of water. The house felt lighter than it had in months. Even the silence seemed different, less oppressive, more like space waiting to be filled. That's when I noticed the red convertible parked across the street, Sophie's car. She was sitting inside, sunglasses on, pretending to scroll her phone. Not subtle. I opened the front door and leaned against the frame. "Lose your GPS?" I called. She looked up, startled, then rolled down her window. "Just waiting for someone." "Daniel's not home," I said. "And even if he were, I'm pretty sure court orders don't count as romantic settings." Her jaw tightened. "You think you've won, don't you?" "I don't think," I said. "I read the ruling." She smirked. "He's not going to stay quiet about this. You embarrassed him in front of everyone." "Then we're even," I said, and turned to go back inside. As I shut the door, I heard her car engine rev before speeding off. The sound was sharp and satisfying. That evening, Daniel called. His voice was clipped, defensive. "You didn't have to humiliate me like that." "I didn't humiliate you," I said. "You did that yourself. You could have talked to me before going to court." "Like you talked to me before buying a secret house with your business consultant?" Silence. Then, "You're making this worse for both of us." "Maybe, or maybe I'm just making it fair." I hung up before he could reply. I expected anger, maybe even a tantrum. Instead, what I got was quiet. A suspicious kind of quiet that meant he was plotting. That was fine. So was I. 2 days later, I received a message from Rebecca. "He's contesting the valuation. Claims you forged the signature." I laughed out loud. "He's really going for it." She replied, "We'll handle it. Don't engage." But engagement wasn't my problem. Patience was. Because while Daniel and his mother tried to rebuild their version of events, the neighborhood gossip mill had already started spinning. Greg Yates stopped me while I was getting the mail. "Emily, heard you were in court this week," he said, trying for casual but failing miserably. "News travels fast here," I replied. He leaned closer. "People say it got intense." "People exaggerate," I said. "But since you're curious, I'll tell you this much. I'm fine. Better than fine." His eyes lit up with curiosity, the kind that fuels small-town storytelling. By dinner, half the neighborhood would know that Emily Ross wasn't the fragile wife they thought she was. Good. Let the rumor grow roots. That evening, Daniel showed up unannounced. He didn't knock. He just walked in like he still owned the place. His face was tight, eyes darting. "We need to talk," he said. I crossed my arms. "About the business or your social life?" He ignored that. "You blindsided me. The judge's decision, half my company, Emily? That's everything I worked for." "Correction," I said. "That's everything we worked for. I just claimed my share." He paced the kitchen, running a hand through his hair. "You've made a mistake. Investors are nervous. They think this whole situation makes us look unstable." "Us?" I raised an eyebrow. "There's no us anymore, Daniel. There's just you and your reflection." He stopped pacing and looked at me, something sharp flickering behind his eyes. "You think you've won, but you haven't. You'll regret making an enemy out of me." I smiled faintly. If I wanted to make an enemy, I'd try harder. He stepped closer. "You're playing a dangerous game." "Then I hope you're better at losing than lying." He stared at me for a moment, then turned and left without another word. His car engine growled as he sped away. I stood there for a long while, hands trembling just slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. He thought he could intimidate me back into submission. He hadn't realized that the version of me who once adored him was gone. Later that night, Rebecca called again. "The judge confirmed the ruling. It's final. He can appeal, but it won't change the court decision." "Perfect," I said. As I hung up, I walked to the window. Across the street, Greg's porch light flicked on. He was probably on the phone, recounting every rumor he'd collected that week. Sophie's red car was gone. Monica's influence was unraveling. Daniel's empire had a new shareholder, me. The suburban street looked peaceful, almost serene. The lawns were still perfect, the houses still spotless. But under that quiet, something new was growing. Power, hard-earned and deliberate. I whispered to myself, "This isn't revenge. It's correction." And in that moment, I realized something. The calm after chaos isn't silence. It's control. The neighborhood had a rhythm all its own. Lawns mowed precisely, mailboxes polished, and cars parked at exact angles that spoke more about pride than practicality. I'd lived here long enough to understand the subtleties, the way gossip traveled faster than the wind, the way neighbors smiled while secretly cataloging every misstep, and the way a perfectly timed comment could tip the balance of public perception. After the courtroom, the atmosphere on Willow Creek Drive shifted. People didn't just look at me differently, they recalculated me. Greg Yates stopped by first, ostensibly to discuss landscaping tips, but his questions were pointed, testing boundaries and gathering information for the community grapevine. "So, Emily," he said, leaning on the hood of his SUV, "heard some news this week. Things went interestingly in court?" I smiled, casual, as though we were talking about the weather. Interesting is one word for it. I'd say enlightening. His eyebrows lifted. "Enlightening? That's polite." I nodded. I try to be polite. Saves time for other things. He paused, sensing he wasn't going to get a simple answer. "Well, congratulations, I suppose. Not everyone walks away with half a company." "Thanks," I said, tilting my head. "Half a company in full perspective. That's the real prize." He didn't know whether to be impressed or wary. That hesitation was my first small victory. Inside, the house felt lighter, though my mind was buzzing with possibilities. I'd spent years maintaining the facade of a devoted, patient wife while Daniel's ambitions grew unchecked. Now, I had leverage, strategy, and the patience to watch him flail just enough to learn humility. Sophie wasn't going to wait for him to fix things herself, of course. Within 24 hours, her social media accounts were filled with smug images of the lake house, carefully cropped selfies, and captions like, "Strategic planning with a visionary mind." I took screenshots. Documentation wasn't only for legal matters, it was for strategy. The following day, I attended the neighborhood brunch. The event was a predictable circus. Fruit platters, overly sweet pastries, and gossip sharper than the knives on the tables. I saw Monica in her element, subtly lecturing anyone who would listen about the dangers of modern entrepreneurship, while Daniel's absent name hung in the air, unspoken but present. "Emily, you're here," one of my former friends, Lydia, said. She sounded cheerful, but her eyes betrayed something else: curiosity, suspicion, and maybe the faintest trace of resentment. "Yes, I am," I replied. "You know, trying to keep my routine intact despite the upheaval of court rulings and new responsibilities." She tilted her head. "Court rulings?" I gave a light, almost imperceptible shrug. "Just the usual paperwork. Nothing worth anyone's gossip. Oh wait, that's impossible here, isn't it?" Her smile faltered slightly, but she recovered. "I'm sure it's all very complex. Must be exhausting." "Exhausting and oddly satisfying," I said, pouring myself more coffee. As the brunch continued, whispers followed me. Not direct, but audible enough to know the news had traveled. People's voices carried hints of admiration and judgment, curiosity and judgment. It was fascinating to watch how quickly the narrative shifted once evidence replaced assumption. I returned home that afternoon with a plan. The first step wasn't confrontation, it was chaos managed strategically. I wanted Sophie's world to feel just the slightest bit unstable. Not destructive, not dangerous, just enough for her to sense that the calm she relied on was no longer guaranteed. I started small. A few minor HOA reports about noise complaints near her street. Not lies, just slightly exaggerated observations. A dog barking longer than usual, children playing later than reasonable. Enough for Greg to circulate around, enough to plant seeds of mild concern. The next morning, I took action on a more personal front. Sophie's influencer event, a brunch she'd been promoting on her social media for weeks, was the target. I knew the layout, thanks to a combination of public information and my own reconnaissance. The sprinklers outside the venue, unguarded and prone to a timer malfunction, were ideal. I arrived early, dressed casually, carrying a bag with a few tools to adjust the sprinkler system. Minutes later, I'd timed it perfectly. The water turned on as the guests arrived. Not dangerous, just inconvenient, just humiliating. Dresses and heels met an unexpected shower, cameras recorded accidental splashes, and Sophie's expression went from confident to frantic in under 30 seconds. I stayed out of sight, laughing quietly to myself, enjoying the subtle poetry of cause and effect. The event was ruined without anyone being harmed, and the photos would undoubtedly circulate online, providing both public embarrassment and a reminder that her carefully curated life wasn't untouchable. 2 days later, I confronted her directly in the grocery store parking lot. The encounter was inevitable, given the small size of our neighborhood and the fact that she clearly enjoyed shopping for visibility rather than groceries. She was loading a cart, phone in hand, and spotted me approaching. "Emily," she said, voice tight but smiling like a predator pretending to be prey. "Fancy seeing you here?" I tilted my head, letting the sun catch my eyes just so. "Sophie, busy planning your next lake house photo shoot?" Her grip on the cart tightened. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. You like to assume what's hidden stays hidden. That's a dangerous assumption in my world." Her lips pressed together. "You're exaggerating." I stepped closer. "I never exaggerate. You just underestimate me." By the time I left, she'd received a perfectly memorable slap. On the wrist, metaphorically, but with social consequences that I knew would sting. Phones were out, onlookers witnessed the confrontation, and whispers began before she even got back into her car. She hadn't even realized I'd timed the sprinkler fiasco and the grocery lot confrontation to feed into the same narrative. Meanwhile, Daniel's office became another battlefield. Investor confidence wavered subtly as snippets of gossip reached the wrong ears. Every failed meeting, every tense conversation, felt amplified by public knowledge of the courtroom ruling and Sophie's minor embarrassments. One afternoon, Daniel tried to confront me at home, leaning against the doorway like he still owned the place. "You've gone too far," he said, voice tight. "Far enough," I replied, smiling sweetly. "You should see it from my perspective. I funded your empire. I know your moves before you make them. I'm simply aligning reality with facts." He shook his head. "You're playing a dangerous game. People don't forget this kind of humiliation." "Nor do I forget what 7 years of my life were worth," I said. He walked away, defeated for now, but plotting. That was fine. He needed to learn that control was never as absolute as it seemed. Later that week, a subtle twist appeared in my plan. Sophie's house, left unattended briefly, had a minor plumbing issue I'd arranged via a contractor. Water seeped into one corner, enough to cause inconvenience without being destructive. Just enough for her to realize that control was precarious, that life's carefully curated stability could be fragile. By the weekend, the neighborhood was buzzing with speculation. Greg Yates, predictably, had turned every small incident into a full story. Whispered warnings, veiled compliments, and the kind of speculation that made people glance twice at the Ross residence. I smiled quietly as I sipped my coffee, listening to the quiet hum of influence at work. Daniel called again, his tone both pleading and wary. "Emily, this has to stop. You're making everything worse for both of us." "I'm making it fair," I said. "And predictable, too. You'll see, one step at a time." He didn't argue further. He knew better than to press while I held both legal leverage and a social narrative firmly in hand. By Monday, Sophie's social presence showed subtle cracks. Posts less polished, captions awkwardly phrased, a visible stress in the images. The sprinkler incident had gone viral in neighborhood circles. The grocery lot confrontation added fuel. People whispered about her attention-seeking behavior, about how her professional life seemed less grounded than her social persona suggested. I watched it unfold from my porch, a sense of quiet satisfaction filling the space where anger used to reside. Not gloating, not vindictive, just strategic observation. Daniel's mother, Monica, stopped by later, ostensibly to check in, but her posture and gaze betrayed unease. She tried to mask it with conversation about floral arrangements, but I ignored the small talk, letting the tension linger in the air. "You've become quite assertive," she said finally, voice measured. "I've always been assertive," I replied. "I just didn't always have cause." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Daniel will have to adjust." "Perhaps," I said. "Or perhaps he'll learn that some of us don't require adjustment. We require recognition." She left without another word, and I closed the door, feeling the weight of weeks of careful planning finally settle into tangible results. That night, I reviewed the week's developments: investor unease, Sophie's public discomfort, Monica's silent disapproval, Daniel's cautious avoidance. Each piece aligned with my broader strategy. Small, believable actions that collectively created a ripple effect. I poured another glass of wine and sat by the window, observing the quiet perfection of the street. On the surface, everything remained orderly. Beneath it, influence shifted. Control subtly changed hands. And somewhere in that quiet, I felt the first taste of real power. Not taken through force, but earned through precision, observation, and timing. For the first time in years, I wasn't surviving. I was orchestrating. Tomorrow, the next layer of my plan would unfold. But tonight, I allowed myself the satisfaction of watching the neighborhood recalibrate around the new reality. Daniel, Sophie, Monica, all adjusting, reacting, unaware of just how much I could shape the outcomes. I lifted my glass in a silent toast. Not to revenge, not to victory, but to inevitability. The kind that comes when patience, strategy, and clarity meet opportunity in perfect alignment. And in the soft glow of the porch light, I smiled. The underdog wasn't just awake anymore. She was moving, and the world was about to notice. The world outside my window remained pristine, the lawns trimmed to perfection, the sprinklers humming like clockwork, yet everything had shifted beneath that calm exterior. Daniel thought the courtroom ruling had ended the story, but he underestimated the quiet, meticulous patience of someone who had been underestimated for 7 years. I had leverage, information, and an understanding of human behavior honed over long nights spent juggling work and emotional exhaustion. I also had something else, control over how the neighborhood perceived us, and that, I realized, could be just as powerful as contracts and ownership stakes. The morning started early. I brewed coffee strong enough to ward off sleep, and while the house was still quiet, I reviewed my plans. Sophie's social life and reputation were delicate, easy to tilt with the right touch. Daniel's ego, fragile as it was, could be pushed in predictable directions if I applied the right pressure. I began by compiling the week's data, investor chatter, neighborhood whispers, screenshots of Sophie's increasingly awkward social posts, and subtle HOA filings I'd instigated. It was a tapestry of influence, each thread intentional. By 10 o'clock, I was out the door, dressed casually, sunglasses shielding my eyes. I stopped by the lake house first. The driveway was empty, a good sign. I needed to check the sprinkler timers one last time and ensure that the minor chaos at Sophie's influencer brunch had lingering effects. Adjustments were minimal, minutes that would turn the garden into a mess just enough to frustrate without creating suspicion of sabotage. My movements were deliberate, practiced. No rushing, no panic. Precision mattered more than theatrics. Afterward, I drove toward the office complex where Daniel conducted much of his company business. My plan for the day included a visit to the office, timed to coincide with a crucial investor meeting. I knew he would be there, the hub of his confidence, and I intended to unsettle that confidence without stepping outside the bounds of legality. Parking a block away, I entered the building, laptop bag slung over my shoulder. Security greeted me casually. After all, I wasn't banned, not officially. I moved with the calm of someone who belonged. The elevators carried me to the floor where Daniel's office was located. I could hear muffled voices through the glass walls, investors discussing projections, Daniel speaking quickly, trying to assert control. I waited, observing, noting the rhythm of their interactions, and then, at the precise moment, I walked in. "Emily?" Daniel's voice carried a mix of surprise and apprehension. His smile was tight, forced. "I thought I'd drop by," I said casually. "Make sure everything is running smoothly." His lawyer noticed me first, mouth opening as if to protest. But I ignored him, setting my bag on a side table and opening my laptop. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, already pulling up documents I had compiled. He hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Some of these documents might interest you," I said, my tone calm. "You'll notice the financial transfers, meeting logs, and email threads. Everything is meticulously dated. Your investors might appreciate seeing that someone outside your immediate circle is equally invested in accuracy." He moved closer, trying to regain composure. "Emily, what are you doing here? This isn't—" "Observation," I interrupted, tapping the keys. "And correction." I displayed an open spreadsheet showing contributions I had made early in the company, highlighting percentages, transfer amounts, and evidence of my role in strategic decisions. His face tightened. I continued scrolling, showing him carefully annotated emails where he had credited himself entirely for ideas we had developed together. The investors glanced up, sensing tension. I didn't speak to them directly, only ensured that everything was visible, undeniable, and professionally documented. Daniel's jaw set. He realized the power dynamics had shifted. I was no longer dependent on his mercy or his recognition. "Emily, this isn't how—" he began. "It's exactly how," I said. "I'm ensuring the record is accurate. Your future decisions should reflect that." He looked at me as though measuring whether I was bluffing. I wasn't. I closed the laptop, leaving the documents visible, then turned to leave. The subtle impact would ripple over the coming days. Investors would talk, Daniel would have to respond, and his own confidence would erode as the narrative shifted. Outside the office, I felt the first surge of anticipation for what came next. I had prepared for public confrontations, small humiliations, and controlled disruptions. Now it was time for a more dynamic maneuver. That afternoon, I orchestrated a chase of sorts, not literal, but metaphorical in its stakes. Daniel had mentioned he'd be following up on a delivery to the lake house for Sophie's event planning, unaware I had arranged for his timing to collide with my adjustments to the property. I drove ahead, positioning myself near the driveway entrance so I could observe without being noticed. The red convertible arrived, Daniel behind the wheel, tense, Sophie beside him, both unaware that minor chaos awaited them. The sprinklers went off, as planned. Water splashed across the driveway and onto the vehicles, not damaging, just sufficient to create irritation. Sophie's expression shifted from smug anticipation to frustration as she tried to exit the car gracefully, only to find her heels slipping. Daniel cursed under his breath, hands tightening on the steering wheel. I remained hidden, silently recording the reactions, enjoying the precision of timing and cause. Perfect, I whispered to myself, stepping back as they scrambled. The scene wasn't dangerous, but it was memorable, and that memory would feed the social narrative I was cultivating. Returning home, I reviewed investor correspondence. Messages were increasingly cautious, the tone polite but wary. Daniel's reputation for control was being undermined not by rumor alone, but by concrete evidence, witness disturbances, and subtle implications. His confidence was faltering in real time, and I wasn't done. Later in the week, I arranged a direct confrontation with Sophie. I timed it for when she was visibly engaged in her public persona, at a grocery store, fully aware that witnesses and cameras could record any interaction. When I approached her, she looked up, alarm immediately replacing her practiced composure. "Emily," she said, voice carefully neutral. "Hi, Sophie," I replied, smiling faintly. "Busy with your next event?" Her grip on her cart tightened. "I don't know what you mean." "You know exactly what I mean," I said. "I imagine keeping track of every detail, every moment, is exhausting, especially when some things don't go as planned." Her lips pressed together, and I saw the flicker of uncertainty. "You wouldn't understand." "I understand more than you think," I said. "I've been underestimated before, and underestimated people tend to have long memories." The confrontation ended without escalation, but the social and psychological impact was immediate. Sophie returned to her car visibly unsettled, and I walked away with quiet satisfaction. Every interaction, public or private, subtly shifted perception, and I kept meticulous notes for follow-up. By the end of the week, Daniel's anxiety was palpable. He attempted to reach me by phone multiple times, each call ignored. He sent emails, polite yet urgent, seeking discussion, explanation, and reconciliation. I read them, noted the patterns, and replied selectively, never to placate, only to maintain strategic advantage. The crescendo of the week came unexpectedly. Daniel followed me one afternoon, believing he could intimidate me into negotiation. I led him to a route near the lake house, careful to remain calm and unthreatened. His impatience and miscalculation resulted in him overcorrecting his vehicle to block my path. It wasn't dangerous, just symbolic. The car stalled briefly in the dirt driveway, engine growling, his frustration visible. I recorded the incident, not for legal purposes, but to document behavior and maintain leverage. He stepped out, pacing, shouting at me over the hood. I remained calm, arms crossed, eyes steady. "You're predictable," I said. "You've always been predictable." Daniel's glare was sharp. "This isn't fair." "Fairness has nothing to do with it," I said. "This is precision. You've built your life on timing and opportunity. I'm simply applying the same principles." He realized slowly that I wasn't reacting emotionally. I wasn't pleading, arguing, or threatening. I was deliberate, observing, documenting, and executing. Every action, every consequence calculated. He left eventually, his ego bruised, his confidence shaken. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. The ripple effect had begun, and the consequences would continue without my interference. That evening, I returned home, reviewing the week's progress. Investor uncertainty, Sophie's public discomfort, Daniel's fraying control, all aligned with the narrative I had set in motion. The neighborhood's social network amplified each incident. I had become both director and audience, orchestrating events in a world where perception carried weight equal to legality. Rebecca called later. "Emily, you've created a controlled cascade. Daniel will respond, but the court ruling is in your favor, and your actions are measured and documented. Everything you've done is defensible." "Good," I said. "He needs to understand that control isn't absolute." As night fell, I watched the street from my porch. Sprinklers rotated in precise arcs, the lawns gleaming, neighbors oblivious to the quiet upheaval. Daniel, Sophie, Monica, everyone adjusting, reacting, unaware of the full scope of the strategy unfolding around them. I poured a glass of wine and lifted it in a silent toast to precision, patience, and inevitability. I wasn't done yet. The crescendo was near. The narrative was shifting, and I was in command. This wasn't revenge. It was a counterstrike, a reclamation of power built over years of underestimation. And when the final act arrived, Daniel would see clearly what it meant to underestimate someone who had spent years planning with patience, strategy, and unshakable focus. I smiled, finishing the wine. The next layer was ready. The stage was set. All that remained was to allow timing to reveal the outcome. The night of the HOA gala arrived with the sort of artificial grandeur that only suburban perfection could manufacture. White tents, twinkling fairy lights, and floral arrangements carefully constructed to convey elegance without effort. The lawns were manicured to an obsessive degree, and the air smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume. Everything was staged to look calm, polite, and harmonious. I arrived just as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows that made the fountains and hedges gleam. The gown I had chosen was a deep red, simple yet striking, with lines that commanded attention without shouting. Hair perfectly in place, heels sharp and balanced, I carried myself with the composure of someone who knew exactly how this evening would unfold. Daniel had no idea what he was walking into. Sophie hadn't imagined it. Monica, bless her, probably assumed she still had influence. I smiled inwardly. The moment I stepped onto the lawn, the whispers began. Heads turned politely, but every glance carried the weight of curiosity and anticipation. Greg Yates lingered nearby, as usual, ready to relay impressions to anyone who would listen. I let the attention wash over me, calm, deliberate. This was theater, and I had written the script. Inside the main tent, the event was in full swing. People mingled over canapes and wine, exchanging polite chatter that veiled personal agendas. I saw Sophie immediately, flustered, and attempting to maintain composure while she scanned the crowd for allies or witnesses. Daniel lingered near the bar, scanning for me, for an opening, for some way to regain the confidence that I had systematically dismantled. I moved deliberately toward the center of the room, giving casual nods and smiles to familiar neighbors, all the while letting subtle glances land on Sophie and Daniel. The tension was nearly tangible, the contrast between my controlled presence and their visible unease adding a kinetic energy to the room. At precisely the right moment, I activated the first part of my plan. I tapped the hidden button that connected to the sound system, one of Daniel's synced devices, which he had conveniently left unsecured. A familiar voice filled the tent. His, recorded months ago, speaking casually to a group of investors, mocking the very decisions he had claimed to have made independently. I hadn't edited it, just captured it with perfect timing and clarity. Heads turned, glasses paused midair. Sophie froze, realizing that Daniel's carefully curated image of authority and control was crumbling in real time. Daniel's jaw tightened, the confident veneer peeling under the scrutiny of the crowd. "Is that?" a neighbor whispered to someone beside them. "Seems like someone's been very thorough," the other replied. I stepped into the spotlight, figuratively speaking, letting my gaze linger briefly on Daniel before turning to mingle. Every word, every glance had been timed to create maximum impact without direct confrontation. Sophie's shoulders slumped, and I noticed her subtle attempts to regain composure fail as she glanced around, aware that her performance was unraveling. The event became chaotic in the best possible sense for my plan. Investors, neighbors, and friends all had fragments of truth presented simultaneously. Daniel's misattributed successes, Sophie's overconfidence, Monica's misjudgments. Each revelation was small, believable, and verifiable, yet collectively devastating. I watched as people processed the information, whispers growing louder and more speculative. I had prepared for Daniel's reaction. He would come to me, try to assert authority, maybe demand explanation, maybe beg for reconciliation. But I didn't need to respond. I had no intention of softening the blow, only of letting the consequences unfold naturally. Sure enough, he approached, voice low, attempting control. "Emily, what are you doing? This isn't necessary." I looked at him with measured calm. "Necessary? Daniel, you've been teaching me lessons for years, about ambition, timing, and perception. Tonight I'm simply applying them in return." His face tightened. "This is ridiculous. You can't—" I interrupted him with a quiet, controlled smile. "I can, and I already have. Consider this a demonstration of long-term strategic thinking. You've seen what it looks like when your own game is played against you." He opened his mouth again, but hesitated. I could see the recognition dawning. My patience, precision, and understanding of leverage had outmatched his arrogance. He had assumed control came from position alone. I had demonstrated that control also came from timing, observation, and strategy. Sophie attempted to intervene, stepping in with a half-hearted smile and a glance toward the crowd, but the moment was already lost. She looked smaller, more anxious, and I relished the subtle power shift. Her carefully constructed image of competence and influence faltered in the glare of fact and subtle spectacle. Monica's expression revealed her dismay without words. The woman had tried to manipulate, advise, and critique every step of the process, but she had failed to account for the cumulative effect of deliberate action, subtle psychological pressure, and visible evidence of competence. I allowed myself a faint chuckle, invisible to most, audible to a few who had eyes to notice. The evening proceeded under my direction without any direct aggression or harm. Every social and professional maneuver, every carefully orchestrated observation, had culminated in a moment of visible reckoning. Daniel could no longer claim authority without question. Sophie could no longer project untouchable confidence. Monica's influence was quietly diminished. As the final crescendo approached, I revealed one last element of planning. A subtle but undeniable indication of Greg Yates's involvement in past neighborhood gossip and manipulation. Evidence that would subtly shift attention away from me and toward the systemic dysfunction Daniel and his circle had relied upon. The whispering increased, attention diverted, and the balance of perception tipped further in my favor. Daniel realized the layers of strategy too late. He had underestimated my understanding of human behavior, my patience, and my ability to orchestrate consequences without overt confrontation. He stood in the center of the room, momentarily powerless, surrounded by the social equivalent of controlled chaos. Sophie's attempts at intervention were awkward and ineffective. Monica's authority, based on perception and intimidation, had crumbled quietly but effectively. The investors and neighbors around us were evaluating every movement, every reaction, with newfound awareness. I moved away, keeping my composure, my pace deliberate, my demeanor calm. Each step reinforced the perception that I was in control, that I had orchestrated outcomes without the need for anger or rash action. The room was tense but functional, whispers rising and falling, attention focused where I intended. In the final moments, Daniel attempted a last assertion, a gesture meant to reclaim authority or control. I allowed it, watching carefully as the consequences unfolded naturally. The crowd, aware of the underlying narrative and the subtle evidence presented throughout the evening, reacted with curiosity, judgment, and quiet approval. His position had weakened visibly. I stayed poised, letting the ripple effect reach its peak. The dynamic was complete. Daniel, Sophie, and Monica adjusted their behavior, responding to the new social reality I had created. Investors and neighbors were engaged, aware, and influenced. Every interaction, every observation, every subtle intervention had converged toward this moment. As the gala continued, I stepped onto the balcony overlooking the perfectly lit lawns. The night was calm, orderly, and deceptively serene. Below, the fountains gleamed, the sprinklers rotated, and the crowd's chatter carried the faint hum of social recalibration. I breathed deeply, allowing the satisfaction of precision, patience, and strategic execution to settle around me. I did not feel triumphant in a conventional sense. There was no elation, no revelry. What I felt was control, clear, undeniable, and deliberate. Years of underestimation, years of support, years of being ignored, had culminated in a sequence of events that left the responsible parties visibly unsettled and the perception of authority shifted irrevocably. At that moment, I realized the true power of meticulous planning, observation, and subtle influence. Physical aggression was unnecessary. The orchestration of timing, exposure, and social awareness had achieved a result far more satisfying than any impulsive act could have produced. As the evening drew toward its conclusion, I returned inside, moving through the crowd with calm deliberation. Daniel lingered at the edge of the room, attempting to mask frustration and loss, but his posture, his gaze, and his faltering gestures betrayed the truth. Control had shifted. Sophie's attempt at composure was similarly compromised, and Monica, observing from a distance, had retreated into careful restraint. I allowed a quiet smile. The night's strategy was complete. All intended consequences had unfolded, visible to those who mattered, and every action had reinforced the narrative of precision, patience, and inevitability. I stepped away from the main hall, pausing to observe the final social adjustments. Whispers, glances, and subtle recalibrations. The underestimation that had once defined my position was gone, replaced by awareness and deliberate influence. The world, for this evening, had shifted in response to strategic foresight and careful orchestration. As I moved toward the exit, I felt the satisfaction of completion, not in triumphal celebration, but in deliberate, methodical achievement. Daniel, Sophie, Monica, and the observers had all registered the new balance of control. The narrative was clear, the consequences had landed, and the stage was set for the aftermath. Quiet, inevitable, and irreversible. Outside, the night air was cool and fragrant with the faint scent of the gardens. The lawns gleamed under the soft lights, and the fountains continued their rhythmic dance. I paused, taking in the scene, knowing that the orchestration was complete. The underdog had claimed her agency, exercised her influence, and executed her strategy with precision. And in that moment, I understood the power of patience, observation, and deliberate action. Control had shifted, consequences had been delivered, and the carefully constructed world of perfection and facade had been recalibrated without a single reckless act. I walked away from the gala, heels clicking softly on the pavement, each step a reminder that timing, strategy, and clarity had created a resolution both visible and enduring. The night concluded on the highest note of tension and satisfaction possible, every intended effect achieved, and the narrative firmly under my influence. The lights of the neighborhood flickered behind me, orderly and serene, while underneath, the truth of the evening's events had permanently altered the landscape. Daniel, Sophie, Monica, all adjusted, all aware, all impacted. And I, having executed the plan with precision, moved forward with calm, deliberate confidence. The game was over, the outcome undeniable, and the balance of power restored exactly as intended.